Forget everything you think you know about the richest people in history, because I'm about to tell you about a woman who made Jeff Bezos look like he was living paycheck to paycheck. Cleopatra didn't just have money. She owned an entire country that controlled 20% of all the wealth in the ancient world. And the crazy part? Most people only remember her for her love life and completely ignore the fact that she was probably the most powerful financial mind of her time. So let's talk about how rich Cleopatra actually was, because the numbers are absolutely insane. When we think about wealthy people from history, names like Mansa Musa or John D. Rockefeller usually come up, but Cleopatra barely gets mentioned. And that's a huge mistake. See, the problem with understanding ancient wealth is that we don't have bank statements or tax records from 2,000 years ago. We have to piece things together from old writings, archaeological discoveries, and a whole lot of educated guessing. But here's what we do know. Cleopatra was the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt. She ruled from around 51 BC until her disappearing in 30 BC, till her death in 30 BC. And during that time, she sat on top of one of the most profitable pieces of real estate the world has ever seen. Egypt wasn't just any ancient kingdom. It was the breadbasket of the entire Mediterranean world. The Nile River flooded every single year like clockwork, and that flooding left behind incredibly fertile soil. While other civilizations were praying for rain and hoping their crops wouldn't fail, Egypt was producing so much grain that they had massive surpluses every single harvest. And guess who owned all of that grain? Cleopatra. Not the farmers, not the merchants, the queen. In Egypt, the pharaoh owned everything. The land, the crops, the mines, the people's labor, everything. This wasn't like modern monarchies where the king or queen is mostly a figurehead. Cleopatra had absolute control over the entire Egyptian economy. She was the CEO, the board of directors, and the sole shareholder of Egypt Incorporated. Now let's talk about the actual money. Egypt had been mining gold for thousands of years before Cleopatra was even born. The Nubian gold mines in the south were legendary throughout the ancient world. These mines produced so much gold that Egypt became synonymous with wealth. When ancient people thought about gold, they thought about Egypt. Some historians estimate that by the time Cleopatra took the throne, Egypt had accumulated somewhere between 500 million to over $1 billion worth of gold in today's money. But that's just the gold sitting in the treasury. That doesn't count the annual production from the mines or the value of all the other resources Egypt controlled. And speaking of other resources, let's talk about papyrus. You know those ancient scrolls that all the important documents were written on? Egypt had a near-complete monopoly on papyrus production. The papyrus plant only grew well along the banks of the Nile, and the Egyptians had perfected the technique of turning it into writing material. Every library, every government office, every merchant in the Mediterranean world needed papyrus, and they all had to buy it from Egypt. At premium prices, that's like if one country today controlled all the paper, all the computer chips, and all the smartphones. You'd have no choice but to pay whatever they asked. Then there was the grain trade. Remember how I mentioned Egypt produced massive surpluses of wheat and barley? Well, they exported that grain to feed the populations of other major cities around the Mediterranean. Rome in particular was completely dependent on Egyptian grain shipments. The city of Rome had over 1 million people living in it, and there was no way Italian farms could produce enough food to feed everyone. So they imported grain from Egypt. Millions of tons of it every year. Cleopatra controlled that supply. She could literally starve Rome if she wanted to. That's not just wealth, that's power on a level most modern billionaires can't even imagine. Elon Musk might be able to crash the stock market with a tweet, but Cleopatra could crash entire civilizations by closing her ports. Let's put some actual numbers to this. Historians and economists have tried to calculate Cleopatra's net worth in modern terms, and the estimates are staggering. The Egyptian grain trade alone was worth the equivalent of billions of dollars per year. The gold mines produced hundreds of millions more. The papyrus monopoly brought in steady revenue that would make any tech company jealous. When you add it all up, conservative estimates put Cleopatra's personal wealth at around $96 billion in today's money, but some researchers think the real number was much higher. The Roman senator Pliny the Elder, who lived not long after Cleopatra's time, wrote that Egypt's annual revenue was equivalent to about 12,500 talents of silver, using various conversion methods. That works out to somewhere between $1 and $2 billion per year in pure government income. And remember, Cleopatra wasn't just the head of the government. She was the government. That money was hers to do with as she pleased. Now here's where things get really interesting. Cleopatra didn't just sit on her piles of gold and count coins all day. She used her wealth strategically to play political games with the most powerful men in the ancient world. When Julius Caesar came to Egypt, Cleopatra didn't just seduce him with her personality. She dazzled him with displays of wealth that made Rome look like a backwater town. She threw parties that lasted for days. She wore jewelry worth more than entire Roman provinces. She traveled on a golden barge that was basically a floating palace. Caesar had conquered Gaul and defeated his rivals in civil war, but even he was impressed by what Egyptian money could buy. And after Caesar vanished, Cleopatra did the same thing with Mark Antony. There's a famous story about a dinner party where Cleopatra bet Mark Antony that she could spend 10 million sesterces on a single meal. That's roughly equivalent to $30 million today. Antony thought it was impossible. What could you possibly serve that would cost that much? Cleopatra's meal looked completely normal at first, just some standard Egyptian delicacies. Antony was confused. This was expensive, but nowhere near 10 million sesterces worth of food. Then Cleopatra called for her second course. A servant brought out a single cup of wine vinegar. Cleopatra took off one of her pearl earrings, dropped it into the vinegar, and watched it dissolve. Then she drank the whole thing. That single pearl was worth the entire 10 million sesterces by itself. She literally drank $30 million in one gulp just to win a bet and prove a point about how ridiculously wealthy Egypt was. Antony was so shocked that when Cleopatra reached for her other earring to dissolve it too, he stopped her and admitted defeat. That second pearl survived and was eventually cut in half to make earrings for a statue in Rome. But the point was made. Cleopatra had so much money that she could destroy priceless treasures just for entertainment. Let's put Cleopatra's wealth in perspective compared to modern billionaires. As of right now, the richest people in the world are worth somewhere between $100 and $200 billion. That's impressive. But those numbers represent ownership of company stock, most of which they can't actually sell without crashing their own share prices. Cleopatra's wealth was mostly in hard assets. Gold, land, crops, trade goods, things she could actually use and spend. She also had absolute political power to go along with her money. Jeff Bezos can't declare war. Elon Musk can't mint his own currency. Bill Gates can't raise an army. Cleopatra could do all of those things. Some economists have tried to measure wealth as a percentage of global GDP instead of raw dollar amounts. By that measure, Cleopatra was even more dominant. The Roman Empire and its surrounding territories represented most of the global economy that historians can measure from that period. Egypt alone accounted for a huge percentage of that economy. Estimates suggest that when you consider Egypt's share of Mediterranean trade, agricultural output, and accumulated treasury wealth, Cleopatra controlled somewhere between 15 and 25% of the entire known world's money. 20% of everything. Think about what that would mean today. Global GDP is around $100 trillion. 20% of that would be $20 trillion. That's more than 100 times richer than any modern billionaire. Of course, we have to be careful with these comparisons. The ancient economy worked very differently from our modern one. There was no stock market, no cryptocurrency, no complex financial instruments. Wealth was measured in land, slaves, precious metals, and control over trade routes. But even accounting for all those differences, Cleopatra was extraordinarily wealthy by any standard. She wasn't just rich. She was the kind of rich where money stops having meaning and just becomes a tool for pure power. And she used that power brilliantly. For 20 years, she kept Egypt independent while all the other kingdoms around the Mediterranean were being swallowed up by Rome. She played Roman generals against each other. She formed alliances through romance and reinforced them with treasure. She built temples and monuments. She kept her population fed and relatively happy. She was a skilled administrator who understood that true wealth wasn't just about having money. It was about controlling the systems that produced money. Cleopatra personally oversaw Egypt's grain distribution. She managed the currency supply. She negotiated trade agreements. She invested in infrastructure projects that kept the Nile's irrigation systems running efficiently. Modern executives would recognize a lot of her management style. But here's the tragic part of the story. All that wealth couldn't save her in the end. When Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, defeated Mark Antony's forces at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Cleopatra's options ran out. She tried to negotiate. She offered treasure. She even reportedly tried to charm Octavian the way she had charmed Caesar and Antony before him. But Octavian wasn't interested in an alliance. He wanted Egypt for himself, and he got it. After Cleopatra's disappearing, Rome annexed Egypt and took control of all those grain fields, all those gold mines, all those trade routes. The wealth that had belonged to Cleopatra and her ancestors for 300 years became Roman property. Octavian personally took control of the Egyptian treasury, which was so massive that it funded his entire government for years. He brought so much Egyptian gold back to Rome that it actually caused inflation, because there was suddenly too much precious metal in circulation. The interest rate in Rome dropped from 12% to 4% practically overnight because there was so much new money flooding the system. Cleopatra's treasure literally reshaped the Roman economy even after she was vanished. So what can we learn from all this? Cleopatra's story shows us that wealth isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about control over resources, strategic thinking, and understanding how money flows through an economy. She was born into privilege, sure. She inherited a wealthy kingdom, but she also worked incredibly hard to maintain and grow that wealth. She wasn't just a passive inheritor. She was an active manager of the most profitable enterprise in the ancient world. She also shows us that even unlimited money has its limits. Cleopatra was richer than anyone alive today by most measurements, but she couldn't buy her way out of military defeat. She couldn't purchase enough soldiers to beat the Roman legions. In the end, all her gold couldn't overcome political reality. Her legacy, though, lives on. Every time you see a movie about ancient Rome, every time someone mentions Egypt, every time a historian tries to calculate who was the richest person in history, Cleopatra's name comes up. She turned her wealth into a kind of immortality. 2,000 years later, we're still talking about her money. And honestly, we should be. Because understanding how she built and used her fortune teaches us a lot about economics, power, and the relationship between money and politics that's just as relevant today as it was in 30 BC. If you want to see more videos about the richest and most powerful people in history, hit subscribe.